Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not but be sworn my love, I'll no longer be a Capulet.
Shall I hear more, or shall I speak at this?
'Tis but thy name that is mine enemy. Thou art thyself, though not a Montague. What's Montague? It's nor hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Oh, be some other name.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to the second episode of Romeo and Juliet. In the previous episode, we discussed the balcony scene, which is central to the play, and it was central even to the episode. We enacted it and we saw it from various angles. We also discussed love and language in Shakespeare. In this episode, I have with me Sangeeta, who is an assistant professor at the English and Foreign Languages University, and we'll be discussing various other aspects of the play. For the thing about Romeo and Juliet is that while it looks simple at one level, it's an extraordinarily complex play. I mean, there's a social angle to it, there's a psychological angle to it, there's a political angle to it, there's an economic angle to it. And the beauty is that Shakespeare brings all these various dimensions into the play. How do you see it, Sangeeta? I mean, how do you view the play as a whole?
For me, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy that is at the same time shares a lot of characteristics with a comic or a romance. For most of the play, you will find that it follows the conventions of a love or a romance or a comedy, and it's only towards the end that it becomes a tragedy. Although in the beginning itself, the chorus tells us or warns us that the story is about a star-crossed pair of lovers. And a Renaissance audience or an Elizabethan audience who believed in the reality of stars affecting human lives, this would have almost given away the story from the beginning that this would end in tragedy.
When we say tragedy, does it always mean that something is predetermined, in the sense that somehow the audience knows, has this knowledge that the end would be this, that Romeo and Juliet are doomed to die? Or is there some element of mystery in the play, and progressively the audience is convinced, that sure, they have no choice but to die,
You see, the difference between a classical Greek tragedy and a play like Romeo and Juliet lies in exactly this point.
Exactly, I was thinking of the same thing.
Yes, because in classical Greek tragedy, the audience was well aware of the story on which the tragedy was based. And also, you have to remember that almost all the classic Greek heroes had, or the tragedy emerged from a tragic flaw which they had.
Can you give an example?
Oedipus would be a bad example, because Oedipus in some sense is a victim of most of the circumstances. But let us look at a character like Lear or Hamlet. We know that Hamlet's procrastination and his character as a scholar and not as an actor or a warrior is the one which ultimately leads to his own death and the tragic and eminently avoidable death of so many other people, including his mother.
Well, how about Lear? You mentioned Lear.
Again, Cordelia dies, Lear dies, there are so many deaths, again avoidable. And why did this have to happen? Because Lear's ego Cordelia refuses to pamper Lear's ego, and at that point Lear banishes Cordelia.
So in the classical Greek tragedy, somehow the character is responsible for what happens to him or her.
Yes, and Aristotle describes it as one of the features of a good tragedy. That is, when the tragedy is triggered not by outside circumstances but by an inherent flaw in the character. Whereas in Romeo and Juliet you can see that the tragedy is due to outside circumstances.
But the greater tragedy in Romeo and Juliet, I mean, I agree with you about the circumstantial nature of the tragedy. But the greater tragedy is that ultimately the families, the Montagues and the Capulets, have to come to terms with their own animosity. You know, I mean, the result of the animosity is the death of
two young people.
Right, you know.
You see, in that way you can look at a death leading to a larger good. But was death necessary to bring about an amicable solution to this long-lasting feud is a question that we have to look at carefully. One is definitely there is a feud, but Shakespeare never gives any hint as to the reason for this feud. We only realize that this feud is a long-lasting one and people have died, and in fact the entire city-state is tired of this feud because a lot of life has been lost. However, should two young people die to bring an end to this feud, or can something as archaic and medieval as a feud end without so much bloodshed?
No, if you are a member of a Renaissance audience, what would you think is an alternative to that kind of an ending? How else do you think the feud could come to an end? You know? Because somehow I feel that Shakespeare is compelled to give that kind of an ending.
If Romeo and Juliet had been envisaged as a comedy and not as a tragedy, the feud would have ended with a marriage.
Very true.
Whereas Romeo and Juliet has been envisaged as a tragedy, and because it's a tragedy, in some sense you will find that it is interspaced with these. Whole action happens only in the span of 4 days, Monday to Thursday, and in between you find so many deaths happening, and it ends with the death of these young lovers.
So the deaths of the other characters in some way are a hint.
Yes.
Or actually trigger the deaths of Romeo and Juliet, like the death of Tybalt and Mercutio, for example.
That's true.
Which was needless. But the context of it is that there is this manhood thing which Mercutio has to prove, in his own way, and Tybalt too. And somehow at that point, I think, look, it's men fighting with men.
Yes, but you see, it's also, we can locate Romeo and Juliet in some sense as at the turning point or the crux where a medieval ethos gives way to an Elizabethan or a Renaissance ethos.
How would that be?
Because a medieval society is one which is rule bound, which also exists in a situation or a society where men has to fight with one another and prove. It's a feudal aristocratic society, whereas when you move from medieval to the Renaissance, you are moving away from the idea of a man as a part of a society to the idea of a man as an individual. So this individuality, where a person's destiny can be fashioned by himself, which is the hallmark of Renaissance, is where you will have to locate this play, that is at the cusp of the medieval and the Renaissance. So, in some sense, you will find that the medieval society with its archaic feuds and its feudal patterns is giving away to a society where Romeo, the young person, falls in love with a character for its own sake, and Juliet, the young woman, recognizes her dreams and realizes that they do not match the ones which her family aspires her to achieve, and rejects their proposal of Paris, of her marriage to Paris, and goes ahead and betroths herself to Romeo. So, you will find that actually this play is a play that marks the change from a medieval to a Renaissance
So,
society.
there are two different societies.
They are two different societies, and that brings about the tragedy. You see, the parents still belong to the older society, medieval society, and the young lovers belong to a new society. And there are some visionaries like the friar who recognizes that this is a lost archaic pattern which has to be rejected, which has to be destroyed, and encourages the young lovers to go ahead and marry.
Right, which is why Friar Lawrence is for the marriage.
Exactly. Exactly. So, he realizes that there is hope for the society if this marriage takes place. That is why he puts his considerable weight behind the marriage. But unfortunately, through a series of circumstances, it does not fructify.
So, in a way, the friar has a greater insight into the nature of the social order
Yes.
than the families themselves.
Maybe so.
Because he is a friar and he is detached from what is happening in the society around him.
Yes.
I mean, detached in the sense he is more objective.
True. Because he is not he is not an insider. He's
He's an
actually
outsider.
He's actually an insider outsider.
Very good.
Because he sees the society from the outside, but at the same time he's a party to confessions. You see, he's also Romeo's spiritual guide.
Very true.
Whereas, and in that sense, you can see that there are aspects of Romeo which we generally wouldn't recognize. Because look at Juliet's confessor. It is a nurse, which is a kind of a body parody of the friar.
Right.
Whereas Romeo's confessor is Friar Lawrence.
Friar Lawrence. But how would you look? Shakespeare, I mean, concentrates intensively, I would say, on all these small characters.
Yes.
Who are very important to the play.
Yes, and they are very well drawn out.
Very well drawn out, extremely well drawn out, you see. So, what would the nurse's role be, in all of this,
The nurse.
What is her importance to, to Juliet, is it?
To
Because
the
after all,
action
she
of
is
the play,
supportive of Juliet,
That is true. The action of the play, according to the action of the play, the nurse plays a crucial role. However, we should also remember that her body jokes could be aimed at the groundlings. So, it might be economic considerations to keep the groundlings happy and occupied. I use groundlings as a term without any
negative,
derogatory
I get it.
Yes, reference. But the body jokes and the innuendos which the nurse occupies, which she sometimes she really crosses the line, and we should always remember that she's talking to a 14-year-old. Juliet is just 14 when the action unfolds, whereas the nurse's jokes are quite adult.
But you see that one thing is that most of the nurses, like maids for example, they come from working class backgrounds.
True.
And the way they talk to the master's daughters, or the master's children, there is this, I won't say working class language, but this language that comes from their background. It's at once patronizing, but at once very funny too.
Okay.
Because a lot of anxiety or animosity, subtle animosity, latent animosity is released in
Through
this kind
the
of a language, through the interaction. But at the same time, I think that having said that, the nurse is deeply affectionate
True.
toward Juliet.
True.
But it's a complicated kind of love.
That is true.
I mean,
When we look at the nurse, we have to remember two things. One is that Juliet, though 14, the concept of age has altered over time. So, when we talk of a 14-year-old now, the idea of a 14-year-old is like a child who is still in school. Whereas during the time, yes, when Shakespeare was writing, a 14-year-old was eligible to get married and bear children. So, the time the way we look at age has altered considerably.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Over a period of time. Also, the nurse, as you say, kind of enacts a point of intersection between the classes. Juliet, an aristocratic young lady, and the nurse comes from a background which is, as you said, working class. However, we have to also bear in mind that the nurse, by her very designation as a nurse, also in some sense partakes of the society that Juliet occupies.
Very true, yeah.
Also, we have to bear in mind that nurse had lost her own daughter. Her daughter is dead, she mentions that, and Juliet for her is a kind of a substitute child. And her loyalty is purely towards Juliet till a point of time when she becomes confused and she betrays that trust which Juliet has. But Juliet's maturity lies in that she immediately recognizes that the nurse's loyalty has shifted and stops confiding in her. In fact, she keeps her counsel to herself about the marriage. She does not confide in the nurse.
Very true. That's also the turning point of the play.
That's true.
So I'll go back to an earlier point that you made about the Renaissance, as where man is seen as an individual.
Yes.
Two questions I want to ask. Do you think because the idea of man as an individual somehow excludes women?
Okay.
But you seem to imply that Juliet is an individual who makes choices and who is asserting her will, actively. You see? So, in that sense, do you think Shakespeare somehow acknowledges the role of women in the Renaissance social order?
You see, surprisingly, Shakespeare's heroines are in some sense more assertive and more mature than his male characters.
Can you give examples, for example?
Romeo and Juliet is a good example. Whereas Romeo's attitude to love grows slowly over a period of time. In fact, you find him involved in a kind of a crush, what we would call a crush, with another heroine called Rosalind.
Right,
at the beginning of the play. And over a period of time, the moment he meets Juliet, he drops that, he realizes that his affection for Rosalind was just what we would now call a puppy love, and recognizes that his true love is for Juliet. So, in that way, Romeo and Juliet is also a Bildungsroman, where the young Romeo recognizes his affection for Rosalind and dismisses it as something that is a passing phase and moves on towards the actuality of finding true love. Whereas Juliet comes across as a person who is conscious of the possibility of love, of the very nature of love itself and its capacity to completely alter life itself. So, in that way, I think Romeo and Juliet would be a good example for this, where Juliet is a more mature character
and
Romeo and stronger character, and Romeo has to grow in order to meet her stature.
Very true, very right. You see. But let me take it from there. That this whole idea, that individual is at the center of the universe.
Yes.
Which is at the heart of Renaissance humanism.
Yes.
What we call, you see. So, while Shakespeare is dealing with the complexities of Renaissance humanism, would you argue, for example, that this is the beginning of the modern world in some ways, because if the individual is at the center of the universe, somehow even in the present, we are dealing with this idea, what it means to be an individual, what it means to be a person, who am I,
Yes.
These are questions that we are still asking, you see. So do you think that Shakespeare somehow opens the platform or creates a platform for that kind of a debate,
The word debate here is crucial because Shakespeare in some sense did not confine himself to presenting an individual as the center of universe. He in fact presents the individual as buffeted by forces beyond his control. So in some sense he is a plaything in the hands of a fate over which he has no control. However, you can also see strongly delineated individuals who take charge of their lives. So it's a world which the world which he presents is a world where these two factors come into play. But the question you mentioned about an individual still attempting to find his rightful place in this world is something that the Renaissance audience would not have had to grapple with. For instance, the Renaissance a Renaissance being or human being had no Darwin to contend with.
Very true.
His world order was still ruled by a firm belief in God, and also an equally firm idea that human being is at the apex of human creation. Human being who has evolved from a lesser animal is not something that the Renaissance man had to even dream of.
Very
that
right,
is one. The other is also a present day recognition that human beings has completely destroyed the environment. So these two
features,
yes, these two aspects do not figure in his mind.
Discourse, yeah.
Yes, or the
Very
discourse. So that way, the world which the Renaissance man had to contend with was a less complex world than the one which post 20th century man has to contend with.
Look, in the previous episode, we emphasized a great deal on the relationship between love and language in Shakespeare.
Yes.
So, do you think we can connect, we can develop or cultivate an understanding of modernity through this connection between love and language that Shakespeare is making in Romeo and Juliet? For example, this assertiveness of individuals or individual lovers. Still romantic love is something we think about, isn't it? Still the idea that our choices are absolute, that we can transcend limitations imposed by families and by circumstances and by societies. It's a very popular theme,
True.
Especially on the Indian landscape, Indian social landscape and cultural landscape. Isn't it?
True.
So, what is Shakespeare's contribution? How do you think Shakespeare is seeing it, that this is something that is this conflict, between love and an attempt to describe a language for that kind of love, that it's going to be there for a long time to come, Is it? Do you think he is aware of these possibilities?
You see, language plays a very crucial role in love because first of all, you express your love through language. However, the borderline between a language which attempts to capture the sanctity of love and it can easily slip into bawdiness. Like Romeo and Juliet itself is a testimony to. The relationship between a man and a woman can be seen as something sacred or something ennobling. It can also easily slip into mere crude joke, as you can see in Romeo and Juliet, because when Romeo talks of love and his friends tries to kind of
very true, they kind of reduce it.
That is true. They can never really capture what he actually feels. So the inability of Romeo to express what he feels in language forms a kind of a subtext in Romeo and Juliet. Also, we have to bear in mind that Romeo and Juliet is at different levels, does not confine itself to a love that is between a man and a woman. It's also about love between a father and a daughter, a love between a mother and a son. Romeo's mother in fact dies of a broken heart when he is banished.
Yeah, that's true.
It's also between the love between a friar and Romeo.
Yeah.
So their love operates at different levels.
In this episode, we discussed different aspects of the play, like the relationship between language and love, the place of the characters in the play and outside in the real world, and the transition from a medieval society to the world of the Renaissance, which somehow might also be the beginning of the modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.